Hello, this is the Lasser New York Real Estate Podcast. My name is Chris Wright, zoning counsel and partner at the Lasser Law Group. Today I'm going to discuss an application at the New York City Board of Standards and Appeals, which I will call the BSA. The BSA is an agency where an individual property owner can get relief from zoning regulations. If you own an individual piece of property and the zoning regulations prevent a viable development, you can go to the BSA, file an application, and ask for relief. Zoning is not perfect, so the BSA was established to allow individual property owners to get relief. The BSA has 5 findings that have to be made. I will go through each finding one at a time and describe how you make those findings and what the standards are. And then at the end of the podcast, I will look at 2 examples of zoning applications that I process to show how the application comes together to make the findings. Thank you for joining us. And now I'll proceed to the slides. Thank you. The New York City Board of Standards and Appeals, how to file an application. My contact information is on this first slide. Property owners can make an application to the BSA to waive regulations that govern their property. This is called a variance application. The variance only applies to a single property owner. The variance application must make 5 legal findings in order to be approved by the BSA. And this is what's really, the first thing that's really important. It's an individual property owner's application. It's not a whole block. It's not a city block. It's not a large area. It's an individual application making that on behalf of a single piece of property. Now, I will go through the 5 findings quickly here, and then I'm going to go through each one of them individually throughout the podcast. And the findings are called A, B, C, D, E, so that's how I'm going to refer to them. So the A finding is the property must have a unique physical hardship that impedes the development of the property, such as an irregularly shaped lot or obsolete building. This is the whole key to the BSA. You must have something odd about your lot that prevents development. For instance, let's say all your neighbors have a 100-foot deep lot and they build houses with the required 30-foot yard. But your lot's only 70 feet deep. So if you build a house with a 30-foot rear yard, you use up 30 feet in the back for the rear yard and you only have 40 feet left. And then you're at a great disadvantage. Your neighbors all have much deeper buildings than you do. And so you can go to the BSA and say, wait a minute, it's not fair. My lot is smaller than all the rest. I need the backyard waived so that I can build a house the same size as my neighbors. That's a classic type of application. Sometimes it's an obsolete building. You have an old manufacturing building, 8 or 9 stories high, built 1900s for pure uses. Those uses are gone. The building's vacant. There's no industrial users to use it anymore in today's modern day. So you go to the BSA and say, look, I have this industrial building. It's an industrial neighborhood. Residential is not permitted by zoning. I need to use it for zoning. It's the only practical. I need to use it for residential because it's the only practical use. So those are 2 kind of examples of what you need. It's got to be a unique physical hardship. The B finding then is the economic analysis. And what happens there with the B finding, as I read here, the hardship must prevent the property from being developed with an economically viable as of right development. So once you clarify the hardship, you go to the BSA, you say, look, this obsolete building, 9 floors, if I fill it with manufactured uses, the rents are so low and they're so hard to find that I'll never have a viable use. So you do an analysis showing your building being put to a conforming use, like a manufacturing building with manufacturing uses that is obsolete, and that you can't generate a rate of return, or in the case of that small lot, you build a small house with the required rear yard, and it's not financially viable. So you have the unique physical hardship from the A finding, and then you connect it to a B finding, where you say, if I build an as-of-right building, it's not viable, I can't get financing. The C finding is the proposed development must be consistent with the neighborhood character. So let's say you're in a neighborhood of 5-story buildings, and you decide you need a bigger building because you have a hardship. Well, if you go for 10 floors, that might be out of character for the neighborhood. But if you say maybe 7 floors, maybe that's relief that's justified and still in character with the neighborhood. It's an important finding to make sure you don't go out of character. If you need 10 stories, justify it, that's fine. But if you want to go for 15 floors, you're going to be out of character with the neighborhood. Sometimes you want to put a residential use in a manufacturing district. That's not consistent necessarily, unless perhaps there's other residential uses in the same manufacturing district. So it's a bit of a judgment call, but you need to try to stay in character with the neighborhood. The D finding, the hardship must not be self-created. This is more a legal fail-safe device. They don't want people to go out there and carve up their property so they can become eligible for variance. Let's say you have a large piece of property, if I cut it in half and go to the BSA and get a variance on each side, I can do better financially than developing one piece, one project on the larger piece. Well, that would be self-created. You can't do that. It rarely comes up. It's more there to make sure people don't do just that. They don't chop their property up so they say have a hardship. So it's like a legal fail-safe device. And then the E finding, very important. The requested variance must be the minimum needed to develop a viable project. So in my example, if you're in a neighborhood of 5-story buildings and you want to put in a 10-story building, well, the BSA might say that's more than you need. We only want to give you enough relief so you can make a decent project, but not an extra profitable project. So they might say, we're going to cut you down to 7 floors because 10 is way too much. So you don't want to overreach. It's best, in my opinion, to go with a project that makes sense, that's realistic, that I need this relief, I can make a reasonable rate of return, and to not overreach. You don't want to get bogged down in complicated findings about whether or not your building is too hard, the relief you're asking for is too high. So now I'm going to go through each of the findings a little bit more in a little more detail. As I said, the A finding, it's a physical hardship. And as I described, you must have this problem that zoning is not perfect. There's tens of thousands of tax lots in New York City. The zoning resolution was adopted in 1961. In some cases, it just doesn't line up. It doesn't add up. And the city, they did their best when they drafted the resolution, and there have been amendments since then. But sometimes it just doesn't line up. As I said, there's lots of manufacturing districts in New York City that have lots of residential uses within them. And the residential district, the manufacturing district does not allow residential use. So the existing ones are grandfathered, but if one of them is torn down or burns down and you want to rebuild it, you can't just do it as of right. You have to go to the BSA and say, I have this small piece of property. It's in a manufacturing district. I want to rebuild the prior residential use. And I'm going to go through an example like that later on. But that's the kind of example. And in the second bullet, the zoning, the hardship prevents compliance with the underlying zoning. And compliance with this regulation must be waived. Like I said, in the backyard, the one with the backyard, if you have a shallow lot, all your neighbors have a bigger lot, you go BSA, please waive the rear yard 30-foot rear yard requirement, maybe make it a 10-foot requirement. I'll put a rear yard in, but I need a smaller one so that I can build the same footprint as my neighbors. And the hardship has to only impact your property. If you have a hardship and all your neighbors have the same hardship, then there's a larger issue here. The neighborhood needs to be rezoned. So you've got to say, I'm the only one here. There can't be 7 other neighbors who have the same problem, because otherwise each neighbor will apply for an application. And the BSA will make it, it's very important. The BSA, you must show you are the only one with this problem. Now the B finding, as I said, the B finding relates to the hardship finding. And what happens here, if you look at the second bullet, you prepare a financial feasibility study. The study is submitted by a real estate consultant showing that a zoning compliant development is not economically feasible. So my example, the rear yard, the consultant puts in a report saying, if I build a smaller house, with a smaller footprint than all my neighbors, because I have to put in this required large rear yard, I can't get it. It's not financeable. I won't be able to make the rate of return of the house is not financeable. If I take my old industrial building and put in and try to find, even if they may not exist, but try to find light manufacturing uses to use it, the rental pay won't pay for the cost of the building. And so there are consultants who do this, prepare this report and show that it cannot make a rate of return. And then what's important is the study looks at market conditions. It takes a look at your building, takes a look at the potential rent you could get from even if it's an obsolete use building. And it looks at the comps of land values, sales, rentals. It's like an appraiser, very similar kind of report. but it looks at market conditions, and that's important because if you overpaid for your property, that doesn't count. If you paid $100,000 for your property and it's now worth only $50,000, the appraiser is going to put in $50,000 for your land sale prices, not $100,000. So you can't argue that I overpaid. That doesn't work. It's all market conditions. And then the fourth bullet is important because the study looks at two scenarios: the zoning compliant development, that is complying with the underlying zoning, but doesn't work. And then it also looks at your proposed building. It looks at, okay, in my case, if I waive the rear yard requirement and I could build a house the same size as my neighbors, it'll look at that and analyze and say that works. And then if you build a smaller house because of that, put the required rear yard, it'll look at that analysis and say it doesn't work. In the case of the obsolete building, it will look at an obsolete building full of light manufacturing uses at very low rents. It'll say it doesn't work. It'll say if I take that large manufacturing building and put it in residential, it looks at the market rates and says this project does work. The A and the B finding are really the key to a BSA application. Then there's a C finding: compatibility with the neighborhood character. We talked about that a little bit. Your height needs to be consistent, your use needs to be somewhat consistent, but it also gets into use, density, and traffic and parking. These are kinds of things to be looked at to make sure that you don't create a parking problem, that the streets are big enough for your project. It's an individual property, so it's usually not a big issue, but it has to be looked at as to what the impact is for bringing in this development into this neighborhood that's not consistent with the underlying zoning. The second bullet, an environmental assessment statement is prepared. And this looks at 23 categories. It's not just an analysis of toxic uses or environmental contamination. It looks at the width of sidewalks. If you're putting a school in, for instance, or some BSA applications will allow a school for certain circumstances. Got to make sure the sidewalks are wide enough for the students. The street traffic is not so terrible that the students can make sure the students are safe. If you're putting in a housing project with a bunch of units, you got to make sure there's parking availability, or there's subways and trains are nearby. It'll look at all these different categories to make sure that this waiver doesn't cause some impact in the neighborhood that can't be handled by the neighborhood, because you are doing something the zoning doesn't permit. In some cases, if you're putting in, like I said, if you're putting a residential building in what is a manufacturing district, then it gets a little bit more complicated because it wants to make sure your property is safe for residential use. There'll be a soil impact analysis of your property, make sure it's clean. If it's not clean, it has to be removed. The soil has to be removed. If there's large industrial uses nearby, we'll look at the impacts of those industrial uses. Are there smokestacks? Do they emit toxic fumes in the air? So this all relates to community character, not just in terms of size, but also to make sure you don't cause an impact to the community that cannot be handled. And then I look at the third bullet is just, I do a lot of applications for schools, and you can do a school application in a manufacturing neighborhood. It's not permitted otherwise. And then that always raises parking and traffic issues. Is there enough room for the staff to park, the parents to park, dropping kids off? It depends if it's a grade school when people are dropped off, or it's a high school but kids walk. Are there crossing guards? So these are the kinds of things that fall under the C finding to make sure you fit into the neighborhood, or if there's you raise an issue, you can mitigate it with crossing guards or provide additional parking. It depends. As I said, the D finding is more fail-safe. It's to make sure you don't do something intentionally to your property to create a hardship and then ask for relief. And there's two important things I want to mention here, though. If you buy a piece of property that the seller chopped up, you're going to be held liable for what they did. You can't take a piece of property, carve it up, sell it to somebody else, and then that buyer can go out and get the relief. So if you buy a piece of property and the seller intentionally divided the property up to get relief, you that's considered self-created. It carries with the land, even if it happened 20 or 30 years ago. So sometimes I have a piece of property and I have to do a little bit of search, deed search, to make sure that it wasn't carved up decades ago. And then the other important part is, let's say though there is a piece of property that has legitimate hardships, not self-created, and you purchase it. Sometimes people have said, wait a minute, you buy a piece of property with a hardship, that's self-created. You're intentionally buying a piece, that's okay. If I buy a piece of property that has an odd shape to it, and the odd shape is not self-created, then I have every right to apply for a relief from the BSA. And the BSA language says right in there that simply because you buy a piece of property with a hardship, it's not self-created as long as the seller didn't create it. So these are sort of legal parameters. Like I said, the main part of a BSA application is the A finding, the B finding, the physical hardship, the related economic hardship, be consistent with the neighborhood. And then the D and the E are more, the D finding is really just don't chop it up yourself. And then another very important finding is the E. And this means don't ask for more than you need. It's the minimum variance. And like I said, if you're in a 5-story building and you can get relief with 7 floors, don't ask for 10 and try to negotiate. It doesn't really work. The BSA, if you go in there with 10 floors, the BSA is going to say, well, analyze 7 floors. Show us that. And then maybe 8 floors. And you end up with this back and forth. There's nothing wrong with if you think you need 10, put your request in for 10, but be prepared to back it up. Maybe you'll end up at 9. It's not negotiation though. I always advise my clients, let's put forward our best foot. Figure out the relief you need to make a reasonable return. Don't overreach. Otherwise you have an E finding problem. You exceed the minimum variance, and then you end up spending a lot more time at the BSA trying to convince them that you need the relief. And when they decide you don't, you lose a certain amount of credibility. So, so those are the A, B, C, D, and E findings. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the required documentation to give you a sense of how the BSA is put together. These are the main documents. It's about 15, 16 documents that are required, but these are the main ones that are required. And every application requires these documents. It doesn't matter with the gigantic building or a small house. You have required documents for every application. And so these bullets are the highlight ones. The first bullet, proposed plans. And by the way, when you submit plans to the BSA, it's not full construction drawings, it's schematic drawings, because the BSA may turn you down, it may amend your project, so they don't require full construction drawings, which are very costly. They just require schematic drawings at this point, and then the BSA approves the schematic drawings, and then you can use those to do construction drawings if you are approved. So you put a proposed plan, which shows what you're looking for. I want a 7-story building in this 5-story neighborhood. I want a 10-foot rear yard and a 30-foot rear yard. I want residential use in a manufacturing building. So that's the proposed plan. Then you show conforming plans that shows the development without the variance, what you would do, what you'd be forced to do if you comply with the zoning. And by the way, that financial report relates to both of these. Proposed plans, conforming plans are used by the financial consultant to prepare the analysis to show the proposed plan works and the conforming plan does not work. And then the BSA likes to see existing plans just so they can see what's out there. Sometimes it's just a vacant lot. Sometimes an old building you can tear down, but the BSA gets hundreds and hundreds of applications every year, thousands actually. So they need quickly to look in front of them and say, this is what you want to do. This is what would be done if we didn't give relief. And here's what's out there today, just so they know. And then the next bullet, affidavit of ownership. That's just to they want the owner to sign an affidavit saying they allowed you to go forward. They want people to go out there and do variances applications for properties they don't own, which they might do. They want the owner has to sign a 1-page affidavit saying, I authorize the law office of Christopher Wright, the Lasser Law Group, whoever it is, to go out there and file this application. Then the next bullet, photos. You provide photos of the site. They usually the picture looking across the street at the site, looking across the street from the site and up and down the street. Again, so the BSA can quickly see what kind of neighborhood you're in. Tax and zoning maps, that's just background information. Here's a zoning map, so they can see what kind of districts you're in. And then the land use map, the next bullet, very important. It shows it's within 400 feet of the project. And these land use maps are colored. They have different colors for different uses. We've seen them. They have yellow for residential and brown for industrial sometimes, and blue for commercial, green for parks. They show the streets. And so it gives the BSA quick idea of what neighborhood you're in. If you put in a residential use in a manufacturing zone, it will show nearby residential uses that you're not out of character with the neighborhood. And then the second to last bullet, list of property owners. You have to give a list of all the property owners within 400 feet. And this is important because these are the people who get a notice of the hearing. When the BSA finally gives you a public hearing on your project, after you file it and go through review, you have the public hearing now. You must send a notice of the hearing to all property owners within 400 feet. It's required, notice requirement. If you don't do it, you won't get your hearing. And then the last bullet is just the project statement. That's what I do. And it details the 5 findings and how you make the all 5 findings. So it's actually the real guts of the project. But I wanted to also show you kind of the support documents you need to provide as well. Now, to go on to notice requirements, we've already talked about how you have to notify 400 neighbors, the neighbors within 400 square feet, the 400 feet radius, excuse me, of your property. And then you have to notify 4 city agencies, required notice. You must send them. And here it's a little different. The public gets a notice of the public hearing. These 4 agencies get a copy of your application. You don't have to send your application to the application is pretty large, a lot of documents. You know, the public gets a notice hearing. The hearing's on July 5th at 2 p.m. You must send a full copy of your application to these 4 agencies: the City Planning Commission, the local community board, the borough president, and the council member. And you must provide proof of service to the BSA. Otherwise, you will not get your hearing date. And then each of these agencies plays a different role. The community, let's start with the community board. And the community board has a statutory right to hold a hearing. So every BSA application goes to the community board and they have a right to hold a hearing and issue a vote. They get a 60-day time frame. That way they can't hold up the project. They get 60 days to hold their hearing, which is usually enough. If they exceed the 60 days, they need a little bit more time. I give it to them, I work with them, but they don't want them to be to a pocket veto. So, you know, they don't do anything in 60 days. You have a right to go to the BSA and say, I don't want to wait for them anymore. Give me a hearing date. But here's what's important. The CB vote is advisory and not binding. And that's important. You go in front of the community board, they issue a yes or a no, or maybe with recommendations. It's important to work with the community board. You want to get their approval, but if they turn you down and you're not vetoed, it's an advisory opinion. And then you go to the BSA and try to explain why you could not comply with what the community board wanted to do. The BSA hearing, BSA's decision is final, how they vote. But so the community board is important. It's important to get their vote if you can, but it is advisory. If they have an issue that's just not relevant to the application, you can go to the BSA and say, sorry, this is not relevant. Then the borough president gets a copy of the application. They don't have any statutory right to hold a hearing. Sometimes they do. Traditionally, Queens and Staten Island do hold a hearing. So when I go to those 2 boroughs, I contact them because they usually have a hearing. The other 3 only do so if they want to. But you know, if the borough president decides to have a hearing on your BSA project, you attend and you go to the hearing and they issue a report. But it's not in the statutory requirement, but it is their option. And if they do have a hearing, you go. And then the City Planning Commission, they oversee the whole zoning for New York City. So they get a copy of the application. They usually don't weigh in. I've rarely had the city planning weigh in on one of my BSA applications, but they want to be notified and they have the right. And if they do have an opinion, they'll issue a letter. Occasionally I've gotten a letter from city planning with some recommendations. But generally they don't get involved with the BSA, but you have to put them on notice of exactly what the application is. And then the council member gets a copy too. Again, they rarely intervene, but sometimes it's a controversial project. The neighborhood's upset. They'll contact their council member, and sometimes council members do show up at the BSA. They testify and they have concerns. And so what you try to do with all these comments that you get from any of these 4 agencies is to address them to the BSA in a submission and try to handle the issues. And then what's important too is each time you do a submission to the BSA, let's say you have an initial application, you do a hearing, the BSA says we'd like you to modify the application, do a new submission, respond to these questions. You have to send that resubmission to each of these 4 agencies every time, so they're always up to speed. You don't have to resend anything to the community. They get the public gets their notice hearing, and that's it. But you must every single time you revise the application, send a copy to these 4 agencies, and that way everybody's on public notice as to what you're doing. And now for the final part of the podcast, I'm going to go through 2 samples to show how the BSA works. So this is a case of an obsolete building. This building happened to be in Dumbo. It was interesting. It was built a long time ago. And the client came to me and they said, you know, this is an old building, it's vacant, and we're in a Dumbo was manufacturing district. It's since been rezoned, so now residential is permitted, but back then it was zoned only for manufacturing. It was geared towards the piers. And so this building could not be converted to residential as of right. So the owner came to me and said, look, we'd like to file an application to BSA saying this building is obsolete for any kind of manufacturing use. It's vacant and we'd like to be able to convert it to residential. Now, this case happened to be very unique because we see the taller part of the building. This was a soap factory. And while I thought, you know, that larger building on the left had 7 floors, I went inside. There's no floors. There were 8 giant tubes to mix soap products together. And it was like the ultimate obsolete argument because there's no way anybody's going to use that building, use those 8 tubes again. And even doing a industrial use, we'd have to take them out and rebuild floors. And then the smaller building was kind of the office space and where they put the ingredients together to make soap. So it was an ideal obsolete application. So I went to the BSA and I said, look, can't be reused for conforming use. And I requested a waiver of the restriction on residential use in a manufacturing zone. And I asked for permission to convert the building to residential. So now let's go through the findings and how I made them. A finding, obsolete building, prior use as a soap manufacturing. That was pretty straightforward, but I had a document, photographs, do description. The B finding, the market rent for industrial user cannot support the build-out costs for new industrial users. So I have my financial consultant look at the cost of, even if we could find, we have to assume that someone would rent it for manufacturing use, but the rents would be $1-2 a foot, very low. And here we got to add in the extra cost of construction costs of removing the soap tanks and putting in floors. So it was very easy to show this building was not financially viable as a manufacturing use. And then the report also showed that we fill it up with use it for residential use, that will generate a reasonable rate of return. The C finding, neighbor, this was in Dumbo. So Dumbo at that point was slowly being converted to residential. There was lots of residential use. And so we were able to show that Dumbo was moving in the direction of residential. But we had to do an EA, an environmental assessment statement, saying that it was, even though there was already existing residential uses in Dumbo, we had to do an analysis of the building, showing it was safe, it wasn't contaminated, showing that surrounding industrial uses weren't about smoke into the windows. So we still had to do the full EAS analysis. Couldn't just assume it just because there's other residential uses there. The D finding, self-created. This manufacturing, the restriction, the zoning that created a manufacturing district and said no residential was done in 1961. It wasn't done by the owner of the building. There was nothing here done, so it was not self-created. It was a manufacturing building. It was zoned manufacturing in 61. 60 years later, it was obsolete. It was vacant. So no self-created hardship. And then the E finding, minimum variance. We said we want to keep the existing building and we want to fill it with residential, and we don't want to add to the building. Sometimes people would have these kind of applications and say, let's square off those 2 buildings, let's make them the same height and add some more floor. That creates an E finding. The BSA said, wait a minute, why do you need more floor area. We're taking you when you convert the entire building from manufacturing to residential. That should be adequate. You don't need any additional floors here. I've seen some applications that do that. They often take time because it's highly dubious. So that's how this one worked. That's how we made the 5 findings there. Now here is another sample application I did. And this is a tax map, and the arrow shows where my property was, which was a vacant lot. This entire tax map was zoned manufacturing. To the right of the tax map was a large resident manufacturing area. And so the block was zoned for manufacturing, but it had mixed uses. The larger lots in the upper right were all manufacturing uses, but all the small lots all around my client's property, which is where the arrow is, were all 4-story residential uses. So in 1961, the city's own neighborhoods that had a fair amount of manufacturing use, but still had some residential use, tended to zone them as manufacturing only. And so the residential uses are permitted, they're grandfathered. However, my client's property was vacant. Sometime decades ago, the building had disappeared. Who knows why? So now I had this small lot, the same size of all, surrounded by residential uses up and down that street, but it was vacant. And so I couldn't, as of right, build a residential. So the application was to restore the prior use, to build a 4-story residential building, just like it was there before, just like the neighbors around there, and ask for a waiver. And I had to argue that that small lot could never be used for manufacturing. It was too small. You can see the manufacturing uses much bigger lots. So this was an application for a use change. And how do we make the findings? Well, the A finding, the tax lot is too small for manufacturing use, and other similarly sized lots are residential, and the larger lots are manufacturing. So the A finding was, my hardship was I was a 25 by 100 foot lot, perfect for residential, could never be used. I could not be viable for a manufacturing use. And so that was the physical hardship, was the lot was just too small for a conforming use. The B finding, we still showed a 1-story manufacturing building on that lot, and we did a calculation of market rent for a small industrial user and showed that building a 1-story manufacturing use was not, the rent it would generate would not pay for those costs. So therefore, a conforming use was not complying. But we also showed a 4-story residential use provided an adequate rate of return. The C finding, well, we pointed out, even though you're in a manufacturing district, the adjacent properties on all sides are residential. The prior use is residential, so it's compatible with the neighborhood. The D finding, again, the manufacturing use restriction was imposed in 1961. In 1961, the city put those residential properties in an M zone that does not permit residential. So this is not self-created. This was done by the zoning resolution. Then the E finding, minimum variance, we just look to restore the 4 stories that were there. I have seen people with similar applications try to put in 6 or 7 stories, and they end up having a hard time at the BSA convincing them they need more. I advise my client, let's just restore the 4-story buildings, be compatible with your neighborhoods, and it went fairly smoothly. That completes my podcast. I hope you found it interesting. This last page has my contact information, my name, address, phone number, and email. And I run kind of a zoning hotline. If you have a quick zoning question, I can look up quickly. I'm happy to contact me and I'll give you a quick answer. If I can, if it's something more complicated, then we can talk about it. But I want to thank you very much for attending this hearing, and please click like if you do. And I look forward to at the next. Thank you.